Hey, it's Joe, and this is a little tutorial about how to do terrain paint. I've got a whole lot of scenarios pre-set up so we can just go through them fairly quickly. So let's start with the first one. Normally you would encounter terrain paint between pavers. So if you look at the one on the left, it's got absolutely no terrain paint, and of course it just looks like the tiles are just floating above the turf. On the right hand, I've painted in some terrain paint, and you can see it looks a bit more shaded, and it looks like it's literally been grounded into the terrain. The theory behind this is that all light casts shadows, and the darkest shadows are around the actual object. There's a thin rim of very dark shadows around the actual object, and then they gradually taper off as you go outwards. So that's what I've tried to achieve here. Don't worry, I will give you some demonstrations on how to actually paint this as we go along. But first I want to give you some examples, and then you can apply them as you go along, and you can see the technique. The plants are the same thing. You have a darker area of soil underneath the actual plants, because the plants don't grow on lawn or turf. They generally grow on soil, or they won't grow, they will just die. On the left as well, there is no terrain paint, and on the right hand side, of course, there's terrain paint. Now if I delete them, the whole lot of them, you can see what it looks like underneath. So you see you've got a very dark area around where the plants normally are, and then a softening around the edges. This is achieved with painting layers and layers of different color terrain paints on the surface. You cannot just take terrain paint, take a square brush with no fading at all, and just paint that and expect that to look real. Okay, let's move along to the trees. Trees are usually something that people also struggle with, but normally they're quite easy. You really just have, again, a darkening around the base of the trunk, because nothing really grows there. Plants generally don't like being under trees, mostly because the trees suck up all the moisture. They don't get a lot of sunlight, so they generally don't do well. In The Sims, of course, we like to put plants all the way around the trees because it hides these ugly bases. So you can see, let's go back out. If you don't terrain paint, you just have this hard edge of where the polygon ends and the turf starts. This is quite easy to achieve, and I'll show you. I normally use, for the darkest soils, I use the starter soil. You take a very, very small brush, and generally low softening, feathering, and you begin painting under the tree, like that. You can also take a very hard edge to paint the initial section, so you actually get that sort of thing. You can layer different colors on it. Oops, you see, you do have to keep adjusting the feathering. You paint it in. Again, this is always painted in with different layers. If you try and paint it all in one go, you just get a very dark, muddy mess. So that's how you do trees. Another technique that I use all the time, which you'll see me in for further examples, is the eraser tool. Soft brush, as large as you can go around it, and you literally just dab the brush. You cannot paint it because it will erase everything, so you go around it, dabbing until you erase, and then often you will need to go back in, and again, just dab some more in. You can never do this in one go. See, you just get a big black edge if you try and do it in one go, and that's how you create these softened areas around trees. Rooms and pools also benefit from a bit of terrain paint. Here you've got the left pool, has got absolutely no terrain paint, and it's just this hard white edge on the turf. With the one on the right, I've painted in, and notice that I don't go particularly accurately around the swimming pool. I literally just dab areas around, fade, add different colors, erase, paint again, to get this sort of very softened, almost natural look where things don't quite grow against hard edges, and you get this soft edge. With rocks, it's a similar thing. Here you've got a rock that is literally just floating on the terrain with absolutely no bases. Right next to it is the painted. Now in The Sims it never looks 100%, but this looks a lot better than that, because you've shaded again what I do is I take the very, very dark, and again, this depends on the terrain that you're in. I will show you an example on a desert terrain. But for greenery type of setups, this is the one I use. Well, you take a hard brush, you paint in around the rocks underneath, like so. And then with a softer brush, you just go in and dab, and you can actually use slightly larger brush, but very, very soft and very feathered, and you get that fading in. I usually like to paint in also this one, the Putter's Pit, which is very light, so you've got to apply it in very small amounts. Again, you go in and you dab, and you just dab in areas. Now, this doesn't look very natural. Again, you take a darker one and you dab some more. Another trick that I use is I use the terrain paint closest to the color of the natural site terrain paint. In this case, it's this green. You go in and you literally paint in the green, so you're actually literally fading the brown into the green, like so. And often, again, your darkest shadow begins to disappear. So you go in, a relatively hard brush, small brush, just so you paint shadows around the actual rock, and that's how you get this effect. Obviously, this I took a little bit longer, and I faded and painted it many times. The same thing, people forget about outdoor furniture that is not movable. These stone benches usually do not move around. They're quite heavy. People put them in the garden and they stay there until the lawn dies. People sit in it, so you get this sort of dusty, sandy area. Again, this is also very easy to recreate. Same dark brown, very little feathering, very small brush. In this case, the areas are very small. So if you paint, you just get a big black or brown spot. So you try and center the brush with the very center of that foot leg, and you just dab. You can use a slightly softer brush if that's still too aggressive, like this. And you just dab once or twice, and you get a softening effect. Now, to create the shadow areas, what we literally are doing with this technique is painting in a lot of shadow areas where the sun doesn't reach and also things don't grow. So this is, again, in layers. Very soft brush, a little bit larger this time because we don't want it to concentrate it, and we just start dabbing in. And you dab in, and again, this is not an accurate thing, you just literally dab in. I take the other one and just dab in, and it doesn't matter if you spill over because you will be erasing half of it anyway. It becomes too light or too dark, you just dab in a bit more color. And you also check around the back, because inevitably around the back it's not going according to plan. In the front, the cursor tends to snap to weird things. So that's, you've almost got I tend to paint a little bit of slightly lighter in front, slightly sandy area. Again, you can take your base colored closest terrain paint and you start blending it in. You can even paint over it as well. It's never 100%. You literally want to create this sort of spotty gradient and blend it in look. Take your eraser tool, quite a large brush. Sometimes you cannot use a very large brush because you've got something right next to it. But the largest you can get, you see that will erase that. Very, very soft. And you see, even that's too close. You've got to try and get in as far away from it as possible. And you begin to dab and erase. And of course, half of it goes and you paint it back again. And this is the only way to create this very natural sort of look. This very soft and natural look. Sometimes you get it right first time and you don't actually need to erase it. But that's how you create this look. And again, you can even go again with the green and just soften it in. And that's how you create a very weathered outdoor type of effect. Now, what about houses? Houses also have dark shadow lines. Now, this is the unshaded house. It's just literally floating on the property. This one I've shaded. So, doesn't that look better? It still doesn't look 100%. I always find that where the two join, it's always, it's going a bit nuts. The join between the house and the terrain is always a hard line, and there's almost no way around it except to put plants or objects up against it. But if you shade it, look at the two side by side. If you shade it, you immediately get a grounding. That's because the light is hitting the building, and there's always a very dark line very closest to the wall, and then you fade it out. I'll show you just on one wall the technique I use for shading around the pool and also the walls. Take a brush, relatively hard and quite small, depending on the size of the property, etc., and you begin to paint like at the closest you can get the cursor to the wall, so it's like half under. You paint in a very dark line. At this point, you're literally just painting in a very, very, very dark shadow. You don't have to be very accurate. Take another softer color, usually in a larger brush and soft, and you begin to dab like this. It's all layering. You cannot do it in one go. Put a bit more on. If you want to use the terrain base color, you paint it in, push in the color, and you layer it. And you go back to your very, very dark color, very small brush, with very little feathering, and you again paint in your base. And that's because you're going to lose some of the base when you use lighter shades over it like that. Of course, not quite like that. Feather it all the way to max. Use your eraser brush, a very large brush, and begin to delete. And you're left with a slight fading. And often you will have to come back in and just paint in a little bit more. And that's how you get this sort of effect. This effect is only created by trial and error and painting over and over. I just showed you very quickly. Here we are looking at a combination of rocks, plants, and a path. To create the path, I'll show you how I did the path. The path is very, very difficult, and it's very time consuming because there's no way to do it in one go. Here, very, very large brushes are your key, usually bigger than your path. So a very soft brush and a little bit bigger than the path, and you start to paint. And you layer in it several times, you see, because then you get a soft. If you just go like this, you get a very, very hard edge. So you literally dab and you pull and you swipe in. Take a lighter color and you go off to one side. Nothing precise, you just paint it in. But now you're already getting these white spots, which is inevitable. There's just no way around it. You can go a bigger brush, for example, and dab over it. At this point, you can go in for the green or the color of the terrain on the actual lot, and you begin to blend it in. And this is how you create this. And don't forget, take your eraser, a very soft eraser, as big as possible, and dab some of it away. Unfortunately, the game brush is not very amenable to these things, and it just erases a lot. So this is you go in over and over, layering several layers until you get this soft effect. If you want a very hard effect, of course, then you paint it very hard, but I go for a very natural effect like this. And that's how I create my parts. And I always I try to think, well, if you came in from here and this is the entrance, you would sort of take the closest, straightest line to the front door, and that's where you would get the path meandering. And then additionally, I paint paths between benches and the house. So I would make a path like this. I would paint in a curve, and I would begin to build up a path between that bench like that, and then layer it, and then that would be the path that the Sims would normally take between 2 points. And they might also go from here to the street, so you'd begin to paint that way, and you just keep building it up in arches. And often you have to come in, you see, you'll get like little patches missing. You need to go and dab, and sometimes it just doesn't look right, and you delete and you start again. Now I'm going to go to a different lot and show you how I paint on sandy areas. So here we are in a desert terrain. Of course, the left one has absolutely no terrain paint, and the right one I've shaded. Again, you use exactly the same technique. There is no deviation except that you use different colors. Here, you cannot use the smarter starter soil. It looks green and it looks really ugly. You can use in part just to give it some tonality. but you cannot use this one to shade. I tend to use this Muddy Mud, which is a more of a reddish color, and it blends with desert terrains. Again, you take a relatively hard brush and you begin painting underneath the rocks. And again, you don't worry about how accurate it is. You just want to start layering the paint. You ladies that do makeup understand the technique of layering. Men generally don't. So you begin to dab, and you can vary the brush size as you go along. Oops, not that. You see, now you need to soften, and you can literally go in and just dab. Here I can use the Smarter Swirl that I said doesn't work so well, but in very small amounts, and it just creates a little bit of variance. You can take a very light brush and just dab in highlights. You just literally dab around. You don't even worry about if it's accurate or not. And you see I've really got a very similar effect to that. This warmer tone also has quite a natural look, and it depends all on the lot that you're on. And then you go to the eraser tool, soft brush, big as possible, and you begin. Actually, in fact, here we can do a little bit bigger. You can actually start to erase away. And often you have to go back, as I did previously, and paint in the very, very dark black shadows with a very hard brush. And that gives you a slightly shadowy. This one, of course, was done with a bit more time and patience. So you see, it gives you a little bit of highlights, a little bit of shadows. Because normally the terrain will darken around these areas. It retains more water. So the water table underneath rocks is generally damp, so you will have a slightly darker soil. Again, also the theory of light. There's always a very dark line around the shadow line of an object. It's a hard shadow line. So you always want to paint that in. It gives you that anchoring, and then you feather it as you go out. And that's how you paint basically on deserts. It's exactly the same technique. You just simply have to match your colors. Just desert, which makes sense, gives you, let me make the brush hard. There we go. It gives you a very similar color. These two reddish colors work very well for deserts because they give you the same sort of tonality. But each world is going to have its own terrain paint, so you need to try and match as close as possible to the color. And that's how you terrain paint. I do hope you enjoyed my little mini tutorial on terrain paint. And here's a few key things to keep in mind. First of all, if you have the grid on, that often gets in the way of seeing the actual terrain. So I tend to switch my grid off. I build with the grid on for the most part, but I turn off the grid for terrain paint because those dotted lines really alter your perception of what you're painting on the ground. So I switch that off. Second, apply very light dabs of color at a time. Erase, restart, erase, start again, paint more, layer on more, erase, and just keep on until you get a very natural looking terrain paint. Also, you cannot do it in one go. So do keep that in mind and paint in layers at a time. Your end result will be far more rewarding. Also remember to use the color closest to the terrain to blend in the edges, and then use the eraser tool to blend that even more so that most of the terrain, the natural terrain paint, shows through. I tend to use the actual terrain color or pattern as much as possible, and then I only use a bit of shading. That way, when people download the lot and they put it on a different, slightly different terrain, it generally will always work, except if it's of course goes from a green world to a desert. Then sometimes the terrain paint does not look so good. But if you terrain paint the least amount, you will get the best benefit of between worlds. Another thing you also can do is when you terrain paint, don't terrain paint right up to the edge of the lot, because you just get this horrible hard line. What I do is, if I terrain paint quite a bit, I will terrain paint in most of the lot, and then I take a very soft brush and I erase all the way along the edges of the lot to make it blend in with the world. Right, so that's the end of this mini tutorial on terrain paint. I hope you found it useful. If you did, do give the video a thumbs up, And if you didn't, do let me know why. Do you have any suggestions for further tutorials that I can do? Please leave me a comment and I'll see if I can help you with that. If you haven't yet subscribed, you might want to hit the notification bell so that you'll be alerted to more videos just like this one. Do enjoy the rest of your day and come back soon.